Chaos and desperation in Kabul as the U.S. tries to evacuate thousands following the Taliban takeover. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. As the Taliban consolidates its position after taking over in Afghanistan, a major effort continues at the Kabul airport to get thousands of evacuees to safety before an end of the month deadline. On Friday, U.S. President Joe Biden again defended his decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. Speaking at the White House, he said all efforts are being made to get Americans and their Afghan allies out safely. He described it as one of the largest, most difficult airlifts in history.
We're going to do everything that we can to provide safe evacuation for our Afghan allies, partners, and Afghans who might be targeted because of their association with the United States. But let me be clear. Any American who wants to come home, we will get you home.
We have a great panel to discuss all of this. Joining me here in Washington is Omar. He is a former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Also joining us is Phyllis Bennis. She is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and she's the author of Before and After U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror. With us, too, from Beijing is Shindo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangal Institution, and he is also the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. I want to welcome all of you to the show. Omar, let's start with you. We've been watching these scenes from the airport, these scenes of chaos after 20 years of boots on the ground there in Afghanistan. And Biden saying today, you know, he still feels like this was the right thing to do as he spoke to reporters here on Friday. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Let's put this thing in perspective here. What interest do we have in Afghanistan at this point with al-Qaeda gone? We went to Afghanistan for the express purpose of getting rid of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, as well as getting Osama bin Laden. And we did. We went and did the mission. You've known my position for a long, long time. It's time to end this war.
Biden's taking an awful lot of flack, Omar, but did he make the right call, even despite all this chaos?
Well, it depends on which side of the aisle you stand on. I think that after 20 years of trying, being generous, making mistakes along the way, quite a few, and spending over $2 trillion, losing about 3,500 Western soldiers, close to 200,000 Afghans overall, more or less, and at the end of the day, realizing that it is not a winnable war and that there's no military solution, you're obviously left with few choices. And I think Biden, someone with 40 years plus of experience with Afghanistan, going back to the Soviet times, knows the region very well, knows the issues that are intricate to war and peace. And I think he made the right decision, in my opinion. It's just a question of whether he inherited a good file from Trump and how he reviewed it, how he executed, and how he decided, and then how things sort of evolved since then, putting everybody sort of on notice. Because remember, it was Mr. Ghani's departure, sudden departure, that created the mess at the airport and the fact that a lot of people just found themselves with no outlet. And so I think you cannot put all the blame on one side or the other.
Okay, well, let me pick up on what you just said. What kind of file do you think he inherited? And also, Ashraf Ghani escaping as he did, were you surprised at that?
The file that he inherited was obviously something that Mr. Trump initiated. Trump's purpose was to end this war so he could take credit for it. And maybe even he was looking for a Nobel Peace Prize. But it was the right thing to do even then, because the American military had almost used everything short of a nuclear weapon to subdue the Taliban and to end the war in Afghanistan favorably. So they were in a huge stalemate and they couldn't win the war. And I think that is a file that Mr. Biden inherited. Don't forget, Mr. Biden has been against this war since 2010 or so. And he expressed his views even back 10 years ago, after bin Laden was killed, actually 2011. And as far as Mr. Ghani is concerned, as for your question, I think that he did a disservice to the Afghan people by leaving office in such a way, hiding and then fleeing without letting anybody know, without paving the way for a transition, which he didn't want to do all along because he wanted to stay in power until the last minute. But the way he did it was wrong. And history will judge him. The Afghan people will judge him. He is now obviously considered as someone who did not take the best interests of Afghanistan at heart.
Phyllis, let me ask you about a piece you wrote in The Nation earlier this week. In it, you write, President Biden was right to withdraw U.S. troops, ending a 20-year war that never should have been waged at all. But we should have no illusion that this will end the war for Afghans. So two separate thoughts there. Unpack that for us.
Well, I think the most important thing to recognize is that this was a war that never should have been fought. This was not the right solution to answer the horrific crimes of September 11. There were other options that were abandoned immediately, within moments, within the first hours of that huge crime. The decision to take the world to war as a response to that, in my view, was both illegal for a host of international law reasons and simply did not recognize what generals and politicians and presidents have said ever since, have said for 20 years, there is no military solution. And in the next breath would say, and so we will send 10,000 more troops and then we'll figure out what to do. Then we'll send 17,000 more troops and we'll figure out what to do. So I think when we're trying to assign blame here, and there is plenty of blame to go around, we don't start with how it ended. I think we start with how it started. And all the presidents, from Bush to Obama to Trump to President Biden, all have made enormous mistakes. And I think that we have to take that very seriously in terms of what the consequences have been for the people of Afghanistan. We owe an enormous debt to the people of Afghanistan, a debt of reparations and compensation. We can't yet even think about that. Our obligation right now, I think, has to go to people on the ground who are in such desperate straits, trying to figure out what it will take to keep people safe. We don't know what the Taliban is going to be in the next period, but we know that there's plenty of people who are afraid based on what they were before. So I think that has to be our first challenge. But I also think that there's a broader question here in terms of how we look back and when we begin the process of looking back at this and looking at what it's going to take to say what happened. You know, people are making this analogy a lot about Vietnam, saying that this looked like the withdrawal from Saigon, and the optics are similar. The facts, the history, are not really very similar at all, except for the fact that the U.S. lost in both cases. But I think one thing that I would look forward to, looking ahead, is what happened after Vietnam was what became rather derisively known as the Vietnam Syndrome, which was an insulting name for the phenomenon that hit the American people very hard for about 15 years after that war. There was widespread resistance to military intervention anywhere else in the world. Didn't mean the U.S. didn't do it, but when they did, it was very unpopular. They didn't feel that they could engage in full-scale warfare. Congress was willing to cut the military budgets, unlike what we've seen in these wars more recently. I think we need an Afghanistan syndrome to respond in a serious way to what our nation, what our people allowed to happen in our name with our tax money, where it was not designed, it was not a war that was fought to liberate women. It was not a war that was designed to bring democracy to Afghanistan. It was a war of vengeance. It was a war of vengeance, not of justice. And I think we are seeing what happens when you try to wage a war of vengeance, imposing a government from outside that did not take into account Afghan culture, Afghan history, of recognizing that power resides locally. Power is based in the family, in the tribe. The notion of all the power in the country being vested in a president and a parliament in a capital hundreds of miles from where so many Afghans live in small villages. 75% of Afghans don't live in a city at all.
Right, right.
So this notion just didn't match what we needed to do. He had to get out.
Yeah, and Omar,
He did it badly, but he had to get out.
Omar, let me bring you into that part of the conversation too, because this is something that I'm hearing a lot in recent days, which is, you're looking at a country that's tribal, you're looking at a country that's rural, and as Phyllis was pointing out, all these pieces that end up in the Western media about how women and girls are advancing in the rural areas. That wasn't necessarily the case. And there really wasn't a real clear understanding of how Afghanistan works, and they were trying to impose this kind of Western concept. Is that part of the problem, do you think, Omar?
It's a part of the problem, and I agree almost entirely with what was said. As an Afghan who was westernized, is and has lived in both cultures for a long time, and then as an Afghan who was one of the very first Afghans to go back in 2001 to try to help rebuild my country, I saw from within. I saw where we made mistakes with strategy, with understanding the country, its people, its culture, the society overall, what it wanted, what it needed. And everything was basically, after a while, imposed from the outside through agents and, unfortunately, people that I know very well and I worked with, through people who actually became very corrupt and didn't have the skill sets needed to understand their own country, and used social engineering to impose by force change on the Afghan people. The same problem that the communist Afghans had. The Soviets helped the Afghan communists try to change society by force, by brutalizing its own society, and that backfired so badly on the Soviets. I think that after 2006 or 7, I think until then we were on the right track, but then it went astray, and I think we lost track of what we were trying to do, how to do it right, and by the end of it, there was no more energy left, no more motivation left, and the Afghans were reacting, and the Taliban is a reflection partly of Afghan reaction.
Shindo Shu, in early July, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi was speaking at the 9th World Peace Forum in Beijing. These are his words. He said the U.S. should ensure a smooth transition in a responsible manner. The U.S. should not shrug off responsibilities and just to walk away from it, nor should the withdrawal result in chaos or war. Well, we are seeing chaos this week. About the same time he was saying that, President Biden was saying people won't be airlifted off embassy roofs. Phyllis pointing out the comparisons right now with Saigon. Talk to me about China's view, because obviously it shares a border with Afghanistan. There has to be some concerns, I would think, in Beijing about, what kind of Taliban are we getting this time around? Give me your sense of what people are saying there.
Well, at the very beginning, remember, this war was also supported by the United Nations UN Security Council, let's say, including China, which is a member, right after 9/11. So everybody supports this as a legitimate move by the United States to take action against whatever who basically committed the crime against the Americans over there. It's different in that sense from the Iraq war, which was opposed by a lot of countries, including China, France, Germany at that time, Russia. So when the Chinese foreign minister warned that this, the U.S. of a hurry departure from Afghanistan without the proper preparation, at that time, not everybody was aware of how ill prepared the situation is. But until what happened, basically, now what we see in Afghanistan in the airport, so people do see there's ill preparation for the departure. And of course, everybody was, including the U.S., China, everybody around the world, I guess, was caught surprised to see the rapid advance by the Taliban and the capture of Kabul in days, a number of days. So that's a shock, that's a surprise, and then understandably there's a chaos over there. That kind of situation, of course, is worrisome to China. Taliban now is going to run this country, whether you like it or not. And so China has tried to understand the Taliban, to get in touch with them, including there's a visit by the Taliban political leader, Barada, to China in July, basically China, the Chinese requirement is similar to that of the US, Russia, or Europeans. That is, Afghanistan and the leadership of Taliban should cut the relationship with the terror organizations, including Al Qaeda, ISIS, ETIM, etc. Afghanistan should become a stable and peaceful nation. They can focus on the nation building, after their victory in the battlefields. So that's a message from the Chinese side.
Phyllis, I know you talked to a former member of parliament there in Afghanistan, a woman who said Afghanistan had three enemies, the Taliban, warlords disguised as the government, and an occupying force from the U.S., and at least we're done with one of them. I think a lot of people in the West will be surprised at that analogy. Talk to us about what she said to you.
This was an extraordinary young woman named Malalai Joya, who was the youngest member of parliament in the first parliament imposed by the U.S. and its allies in November of 2001, or December, I guess it was. And she said this, it was quite extraordinary. She said this in about 2009. And what she said afterwards, she said, we women and we in civil society, she said, have these three enemies, the Taliban, these warlords disguised as a government, and the U.S. occupation. And she went on to say, if you could get rid of one, we'd only have two. And I was struck by the sort of extraordinary pragmatism of it, that it was a recognition that getting U.S. troops out, getting U.S. bombing to end, was not going to end the challenge for Afghans, but it was going to get rid of one major force that was preventing much of the change that was going to have to ultimately come from within, from inside Afghanistan. I did want to just say one thing in the historical sense about the UN resolution that my colleague just referred to, that was passed just 2 days after the 9/11 attacks and was, as he said, voted unanimously by the UN Security Council. But that resolution was not to authorize the use of force. It was very specifically drafted by the United States under the terms of Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, not Chapter 7. Only a Chapter 7 resolution has the force to say that it authorizes the use of military force. This was taken under the terms of Chapter 6. Many of us believe that the specific reason was not that the U.S. was afraid that there would not be support for military force, but that the U.S. government under George Bush did not want to acknowledge that the United Nations should have any role in making that decision. So I think it's an important historical point about the lack of legality for the U.S. invasion that began on October 7th, 2001.
Omar, let's look at the present and the future, because we still see all these people clamoring outside the airport trying to get out. There were reports today that the planes weren't taking off because, in Qatar, they've got so many people. Where are we going to send these people? So talk to me about this, because this is still kind of a powder keg situation, isn't it? I mean, you've got U.S. forces, they've got weapons. You've got Taliban forces, they've got weapons. A mistake can be made. Describe what we're seeing right now, and what are your concerns?
Well, I think that the whole Afghanistan could have been a powder keg, given the fact that we had apparently hundreds of thousands of armed men waiting to fight the Taliban, and Taliban were ready to attack the government. And it didn't really pan that way, really, did it? It was taken over, Afghanistan was taken over with very few shots fired. This particular episode at the airport, obviously, again, was instigated as soon as Ghani fled and left a vacuum. And then the Taliban were faced with an uncertainty, and they walked into Kabul because of a vacuum that was created, and people started panicking. And so I think that it's coming under control. I think that within 2 to 3 weeks, hoping that there won't be any mishap, that this will end. This is a small transition chapter in the history of the big transition that has happened from a U.S.-supported government to a Taliban-run government that now has to open the doors to other Afghans. So we're all waiting to see that with the arrival of Mr. Baradar tonight in Kabul and other Taliban leaders, what are they going to propose? What is their thinking? Or do they want to create a broader-based political structure, or do they want to restrict it to Taliban power? And if that is the case, then I think that we are going to have a lot of questions internally in Afghanistan about whether the Taliban have changed or not, for the better or for the worse. And internationally, it's going to cause a very big problem for the Taliban, because I think initially many countries will not recognize them and will also withhold assistance very much needed by the Afghan people right now who are suffering. So the Taliban have a huge strategic decision to make in the next few days, and to show that they are open to the political discussions and inclusivity and a broad-based approach to politics and development in Afghanistan.
I'd like to invite into the conversation Ahmad Shah Mohibi. He's the founder and president of Rise to Peace, and he advised the U.S. State Department in Afghanistan. He's joining us now. You actually have been, I understand, in contact with people on the ground there just outside the airport. Can you give us a scene setter of what they're telling you about what's happening?
Well, glad to join. Well, as we are speaking right now, the gates are closed. It's a total chaos, a disaster. The whole execution plan of the evacuation has failed. People are outside the gates getting beaten by the guards, the Unit 01 of the Afghan forces. And the U.S. forces, they have no clue what's going to happen. It's a point that the crowd is so, there's thousands of people that they have lost their control. So I do not see the possibility of this going away within, I would say, weeks, even months, given that the current strategy is a complete failure. It's not working. So I had a journalist. We have videos coming out, and a lot of media platforms have been using our videos. It's showing the actual reality on the ground. Millions of people have watched it, and it contradicts what President Biden says at the presidential palace today, that although he admits that the strategy has failed and he should have done a much better job, but in Kabul we are seeing thousands of people going to the airport. Most of them have nothing to do with U.S. Army or U.S. forces. They just want to get out of that country. So it's a total chaos.
And I should say, Ahmad, we're looking at some of the video you provided us. And it's also worth pointing out, I did your introduction, but I did not mention that you assisted the U.S. military in various capacities to help train the forces there, the Afghan security forces. There's been a lot written about how many of them dropped their weapons and some ran into Tajikistan, others just simply folded. I want to get your sense of what happened there, because there's been a lot of different reporting about why they did what they did.
Well, their president betrayed them, their president lied to them, their president fled the country. Why a soldier should fight the Taliban when the president is so busy packing billions and millions of dollars at the presidential palace? I think that's the number one. The prolonged, in 2006, I started building a strong Afghan army with so many other brave Americans and Afghan soldiers. It was a very strong army. They had all the technical weapons. They had the beautiful, really strong cars, machineries, helicopters. What they did not have a strong leadership. From this CGTN platform, I have said the past couple of years that Afghanistan needs a strong leadership. Well, President Biden told Ashraf Ghani that we will help you, but you got to take the lead, take control. He went to Afghanistan. He did not tell his generals. The Army Chief of Staff, I met him in Washington, D.C., a really smart guy, and he was willing to fight, but then the president betrayed all of them. Most of them have been captured by the Taliban, and who knows what's going to happen to them. It was not about the training we gave them. It was not about their capabilities and their braveness. It was about their commander-in-chief fled the country and left their soldiers without even telling them, I would say. Even his guards, some of the guards at the presidential palace and some of the far towers did not even know that the president has left.
And Shindo Shu, as you know, in July, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization met in Tajikistan. This was about a week after some of these soldiers had fled into the country. And a lot of the conversation there was about regional stability. You've got a lot of countries bordering Afghanistan. There are concerns, and it's been kind of brought up here in this discussion, that, the funding's going to just basically end. And you're going to probably see some refugees spilling over into these neighboring countries. Talk to me about regional stabilities and the concerns there, Shindo Shu.
Yes, the concern, for China and other countries, in particular the neighboring countries like Tajikistan, like Pakistan, the concern, obviously, one of the top concerns is the refugee crisis. For Pakistan, there are already, about 1 million refugees from Afghanistan, and I'm not sure they can take any more. And of course, the situation is far from ideal, let's say, for those refugees living in that country. And Central Asian countries, that's the concern. And the second concern, of course, you can see the security. We talked about, because of the similarity of the ideology of Taliban and those of like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. So the concern is like whether they have the determination to cut the links with those groups. And so in that sense, basically everybody will benefit from a stable and peaceful Afghanistan. Whoever the leadership is, it doesn't matter as long as this country is stable and peaceful. That's good to Afghanistan. That will be good to regional countries. So basically, that's the idea. And then, folks will talk about, say, under this, against the background of a stable country. So you can talk about investment and trade, the creation of jobs, and the prosperity, a better life for people in this region, including Afghanistan.
Ahmad, stable and peaceful, what's your view of the future under the Taliban? They said all the right things at the news conference, but I get a sense that you don't necessarily believe it.
It's hard to trust the Taliban, and the Taliban needs to show in actions that what is it that they would like to do. I think if we look at it, they made a deal with the U.S. and did not deliver any of them. So promises and all these, I always say this, Taliban are engaged in a psychological warfare. It's based for the Taliban to compromise and have some sort of inclusive government with other political leaders that currently in Uzbekistan or Pakistan, some in Dubai and others in Panjshir Valley resistance. Look, the Panjshir resistance is really, really about freedom, democracy, and how they could protect the country from a dark chapter of regime. The Taliban really are engaged in a world recognition kind of strategy. Do you want your brain, mine, all of these people to think that Taliban have changed? But here's the thing, the Taliban ideology has never changed. So what you could change is that international community and all of the other organizations to focus on rehabilitating, de-radicalizing the generation, the youth, as Mr. Ambassador and earlier we were talking about other issues in Afghanistan. So these youth needs to be de-radicalized because they have a lot of grievance. They have been fighting the country. Otherwise, it's really hard. I think Taliban needs to show in actions, not in symbolic speeches.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all our guests for joining us. A great discussion, and thank you for joining us as well for this edition of The Heat. Have yourself a great weekend.